Let's just take that forward to the current competitions in Asia and Shenzhen and other places. The Natural History Museum, the Opera project, and then the current amphitheater project. Just on that vein of the organic kind of style, moving away from crisp, clean, rational, modern forms.
Right. Well, I'm going to go back to Tom Gallagher here. When you started the New York office in 2009, you carried this expertise in performing arts and cultural arts, and you actually came to know Bob Niederlander.
Yeah.
And of course, they're one of the major producing entities. Bob was founding an entity called Niederlander Worldwide.
Correct.
And he wanted to take the show on the road. So it was this model that he had taken across America of, from New York to LA and cities in between, of producing and then being able to sit those shows down in these large theaters. And Broadway roadhouses, generally 2,000 to 3,000 seats. And he wanted to do that model in China, and he called you and wanted to develop a Broadway district in Shanghai. You were able to turn that into an initiative where you and I started a corporation, which was a WOFE, wholly owned foreign enterprise in the free trade zone in Shanghai,
Right.
and do the work in China, partnering with Niederlander and with the client. And so we did a master plan for 5 venues, one of which is almost done with construction.
Right.
And we started to look at other work in Asia. Then when we merged with DLR Group, they had a studio in Shanghai, and they proposed that we merge the two. And then we started working on competitions in Asia and the Middle East and so on. But I think people need to understand that the process of selection of architects in the US is not the process that's typical in Asia and in Europe. In the US, you make lists and you have requests for proposals and you have interviews, and there often isn't design accompanied by it. In Europe and in Asia, commissions are won by competitions. And so the clients either do an open call for ideas to pre-qualify, which can involve a considerable amount of design. And so we now have a studio there of about 30 people, and it's paired largely with resources out of our New York studio, where you are, with my involvement, and we have done a number of competitions. We've won some. In Beauchamp, also, we just recently placed second out of a field of about 40 for this amphitheater, this Opera by the Sea, which you worked on with me in Xiamen. We placed through the first round and into the second round on really important projects to do the Shenzhen Opera House, the Shenzhen Museum of Natural History, the latter of which was exhibited at the Chicago Athenaeum, or received an award. And we are in the final 3. It's still waiting for the judgment to do a new theater of opera and symphony and ballet in Ho Chi Minh City, which is the former Saigon, Vietnam, and other projects. So we've worked on about 10 to 12 competitions. And these are projects of extraordinary scale. I mean, they're like nothing you've ever witnessed in America. They're 1 million square feet up. They're billion-dollar budgets. They're huge programs of usually multiple venues. They're museums combined with opera houses, combined with symphony halls, and they involve acres and acres of lands, and they're really urban design problems. They involve transportation, parking, artist housing, they're kind of cities within cities. That's the stuff that we've been working on now, and it's been extraordinary in terms of the impact on our portfolio. And almost all of it in terms of design, starts with the big idea.
Right.
Is it the wave? Is it the tide? What's the symbol? What's the cultural symbol of this region? Or what is the topographic symbol or the natural feature? And then how does that inspire the design? How do we interpret that? How do we take that through all the detail and express that poetically? It's the way you build a studio and you grow experience and expertise. I mean, how do you excite architects? How do you attract them to want to invest in design? You need projects like that, because people, they feed on a heavy diet of design calories. And if you don't provide the calories, they starve.
Right.
And they go somewhere else foraging. And so you're able to cultivate a fantastic staff that's very energized because of the collaborative experience of working on these extraordinary commissions.
The publicity that we've gotten internationally has been remarkable. I'm interested, if it's difficult within the firm structure to convince others of the value of the expenditures, often over and above the stipends, to work on these competitions.
Yeah, I think you have to see it as investing in yourself and your portfolio. I've always had this theory that if you go for the money, you're never going to get there. If you go for design, you'll be richly rewarded. Your reward comes through great commissions, great projects with clients that have aspirations themselves. And so you do have to invest.
Right.
You have to invest in people, and you have to invest in the design of the projects, and you have to invest in the clients. I think there's a strong payback for that. We've been fortunate that we've been rewarded by that. We've taken a lot of risks,
Right.
But they've worked out.
You mentioned the Africa project. Let's talk about that a little bit. The Palais des Arts, and obviously that was a project where we teamed with Aranda Lash, but they brought us in as a design partner and also as a super consultant to provide leadership on so many different levels of the different disciplines that were involved in that kind of mixed use, amphitheater with a multi-purpose performance hall.
It's an incredible experience. I mean, one of the great things about collaborating with premier designers and different cultures is your ability to learn and grow. It's a really iconic project on international competition. It's on the estate of the president of Gabon. It's in a rainforest. It's actually within a zoological kind of context.
I'd like to transition now to the straws and what's happening there in Florida. And I can see the influences of many of these competitions and different efforts that you just mentioned on that project. Why don't you tell us about that?
Well, the straws they found us through Playhouse Square. So the Strauss Center is a performing arts center that was built originally in the 1980s in Tampa. And their director was a good friend of Art Falco's. And they would often kind of come together at these national arts conferences where major performing arts leaders would share ideas. And so she brought me in to kind of look at master planning and ideas for the Strauss Center. And I've worked with them probably continuously over 20 or 25 years. Ultimately, there became a master plan to completely rethink this complex, which hadn't really been renovated extensively for 30 years. It was to also make it a destination for people in the region, even if they didn't buy a ticket and come into the venues. Would they come there just to be in this cultural environment? So we designed boat slips on the river that you could bring your boat in. We developed an icon in the river, which is like a marker of like you're here. We developed a roof terrace for 2,000 people. We developed an event center for 600 people, a conservatory, fine dining, 2 cafes, outdoor stage and amphitheater, an event terrace where they could have festivals for up to 10 or 15,000 people, new lobby space, donors lounges. I mean, we redid the whole kind of public side of this complex. We worked on the design for the last 15 years. It's in design development. It's very organic. It is nothing like the orthogonal kind of boxy modernism of the original 1980s complex. It's alluvial, meaning it's derived from the impact of the Hillsborough River on its riverbanks and the course of the river through Tampa. It's very organic and it's very sculptural. It's kind of the skin of this edition is conceived like a really interesting skirt or dress, that is variably perforated to allow views out or solid if we need sun screening or shelter. It's something you could probably only get away with also in Florida. And this has inspired our work on a number of other facades recently. You use it as a proving ground, but this is probably late generation stemming out of this, Tempe Art Center.
You mentioned long-term relationships. Obviously, I've witnessed a number of those with these historic theaters and additions to them. A significant project that you recently completed was the Sacramento Safe
Credit Union.
Safe Credit
Theater.
Union.
We won this kind of in a national selection. We had no office or staff in California. So it was quite a feat, I think, to convince them that we could do a project which is probably going to end up at $125 million in Sacramento. It really exercises our integrated design disciplines of structural, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, architecture, interiors, theatrical, lighting, audiovisual, acoustics. It's also very interesting in that it's the world's largest kind of application of an ERES, which is an electronic architecture of the sound system. Through taping sound and delaying it by milliseconds, you can simulate the reverberation of maybe 2.3 seconds or what you would have in a perfectly designed hall. And so it can have different reverberation and signatures for different types of performances, symphony versus a Broadway musical. Like the Asia projects in competition, we came up with a theme that really resonated with the city that I think has influenced a lot of the pattern work of the design. And Sacramento is nicknamed the City of Trees. We photographed through trees to see kind of dappled light, light filtering through a canopy of trees.
The leftover shape.
Yeah, and from that, we converted that to a digital file to be used to laser cut steel. They're really beautiful, these canopies.
Yeah.
But there's a recurrence of that theme in the carpet and other ornamental work. So it reminds one kind of subconsciously or consciously of nature.
I know that there was work at the Hillcrest Hospital and a project in Twinsburg, a new campus there. What can you tell us?
Two major projects went on hold after 9/11, and one was the museum on the lake, which never came back, the Crawford Museum. But the other was the major expansion of Hillcrest Hospital, which is kind of the flagship suburban hospital of the Cleveland Clinic. And the CEO came to us and he revived that commission, which was wonderful for our studio. And we did this major re-imaging of the campus and expansion of a new bed tower. And that forms the whole visage and profile of the Hillcrest Hospital now. And that was a project that was extremely well received by the clinics. So they commissioned us to do the Twinsburg Medical Center, which is the first new build campus that they had undertaken since the clinic was founded in the 1930s. And it was on an extraordinary, beautiful site in Twinsburg, and very steep slope, and it had on-site streams and wetlands and old growth forest. And we had to figure out how to dovetail and insert this new medical center, but save the kind of topography and the wetlands and all of these elements that were important to the Environmental Protection Agency and all the conservation entities. And it took us about a year and a half to figure out how to get site plan approval. And we inserted this rather simple modern form into the hillside, and also developed what I think is a really handsome surface parking lot for the visitors parking, all graced with an orchard of matched red maple trees, which becomes a scarlet vineyard on the slope in the fall. That was our second major project for the clinic in the early 2000s.
The next project I wanted to ask you about is the Future Gen. I mean, there's a number of sustainability aspects, but also I'm intrigued by the formal language of that. And just tell us what all is going on there.
Future Gen came to our notice shortly after we founded the Washington office. And it was an initiative of the consortium of the largest power producers, coal companies, energy producers, not only in the US, but in Australia, around the world, and the Department of Energy. And they were going to create a prototype to demonstrate how you could have a zero emission coal plant, carbon fueled plant. And it was through carbon sequestration, so that the carbon would be captured and it would be forced into voids, which are very deep in the earth and the rock formations. So it involved a visitor center. It involved an interpretive center, which was a museum that talked about carbon capture and this technology. And it also had research and development offices. And so we created this very sculptural complex, which I think has had a lot of influence on projects like the Strass Center in Tampa and a lot of our later work. We used it as a real kind of proving ground of design ideas. It was never built because the Obama administration didn't want to be seen as favoring fossil fuels, and they didn't want any investment of the US government to go into things that celebrated carbon. But as a portfolio piece, it was very important to our firm.
All right, well, we're sitting here in the Allen Theater within Playhouse Square, and I know the firm has done most or all of the work here, and you've already mentioned that Pete Van Dyke and the firm earlier was instrumental in saving Playhouse Square, but tell us a little bit about the work here, and in particular the Allen Theater.
Peter Van Dyke had begun planning the master plan for Playhouse Square in the 1970s on a pro bono basis. And the first project that was developed by Playhouse Square, and at that time it was the only one that they saw happening. They didn't have the vision of all the other theaters. They just wanted to get one of the dark theaters to be reactivated, was the Ohio Theater. And that opened in 1981, just at about the time I entered the firm, so I went to the opening. But the firm continued to be involved in Playhouse Square and the State Theater and then the Palace Theater. I increasingly became involved in these projects, and a significant one was the Idea Stream project, and Art Falco, who was then the CEO, called me and asked me to figure out how to plan to get this broadcast entity into Playhouse Square in this former warehouse building. And what we did was we merged a radio station which kind of hosted the local affiliate of National Public Radio, and a television station which was the local affiliate of PBS. We put them together. They were two separate operating entities. We put them together and we put them into this building, and then we merged it with the Arts and Education Center of Playhouse Square. And we called the building the Idea Center, and the operating entity of broadcast was Idea Stream. I'd never designed anything in broadcast. It was an adaptive reuse. We used tax credits, and it was also quite nice because we were able to open it up to the street. We put the radio station and the dance studio actually in storefronts on Euclid Avenue because we were retailing the arts and also communications and broadcasts. So passersby could see the activity within the building. And, you know, it was also one of our first integrated projects of engineering, historic preservation, and architecture and technology.
And then following that, I know you did work at the Hanna Theater, and there was a major kind of rework of that space. Tell us about that.
Yeah, the Hanna, I mean, what was great about the Hanna was working with the staff of the Great Lakes Theater Festival and Charlie Fee, their CEO in particular, their director. But the assignment that was given to us was to convert the Hanna to a theater that could host the Great Lakes Theater Company. Previously, I mean, while originally it was a movie palace, it later had been renovated so that the orchestra floor had been cleared out and became kind of a cabaret space. And they had shows that were produced in here with the runway coming off the stage and the audience at tables and having drinks and dinner and so on. And the idea was to insert a 500-seat repertory theater within the shell of originally a 1,400-seat theater that had been partially adapted to cabaret. And so we basically truncated the theater, and it was kind of interesting because the theater really didn't have enough space for concessions in a lobby, but we had this embarrassment of riches of excess theater space because we were going from 1,400 to 500 seats. So we actually sliced off the rear of the orchestra floor, and we put lounges and a bar there, but they were inside the audience chamber, and they were ticketed spaces. So you could sit at a seat at the bar, and you could have a drink, and you could watch the show, or you could come with a dozen of your friends and sit in a corner of the orchestra floor in the lounge and have your party and watch the show. And afterwards, the actors and actresses would come back and visit patrons who were lingering around in the boxes and at the bar. And it was a really radical idea about seating and concessions, and it broke down the formality of these historic theaters. We also designed it so it could play thrust or straight proscenium with this interesting hydraulic stage design. So I think it was our most innovative theater plan.
I see a lot of similarities in the overall planning here of the Allen Theater relative to that.
The Allen itself was almost 3,000 seats, a real kind of shoebox. And we were asked to look at developing this for a number of uses. We had independently come to us. We had the Cleveland Playhouse ask us to plan a new venue. It wasn't necessarily in Playhouse Square, but we developed a 3-venue complex of a 500, a 300, and a 100-seat complex in new construction. So we did that feasibility study and said, here it is. Case Western came to us and they wanted to do the theater department, and they wanted a 500 and a 300 and 100 seats on the campus in new construction. And then Cleveland State came to us and they wanted a complex of a 300 and a 500 and a 100-seat theater. Wow. So we had 3 commissions within 1 year to study new complexes, and it was too much for any of them to afford. And so I called Art Falco, who was the head of Playhouse Square, and I said, these 3 entities each want to do 3 theaters. Can you provide a home for them? And Art commissioned us to study converting the 2,000-seat Allen complex to accommodate those 3 entities, and they would call it the Power of 3, and they would be under the umbrella of Playhouse Square. Now suddenly, because it was adaptive reuse, not all new construction, they could afford it. Their operating costs shrank dramatically because they were under the umbrella of Playhouse Square and they were sharing the venues. And it really excited the donors because rather than fund 3 different entities in town, they only funded one. So that was the Power of 3 project, and it resulted in this venue in the Allen. I was looking for a way that you could acoustically kind of narrow the house, but still be able to see the historic facades. And so we needed a solution that was visually transparent, but acoustically opaque. And so we decided that we would develop sidewalls that reduce the volume dramatically of the orchestra floor and provided early and reflections. They would be done out of graduated perforated metal and backed up by Lexan. So they were visually transparent, but they were reflective as acoustical surfaces, and that you could then still appreciate both the new and the old. It was a bit radical. It has excellent acoustics, and it's kind of led us into this practice of being hired to do these major surgical interventions of theaters.
I understand also that it's built in a way that it can be undone. And preserve the original architecture.
Everything can also be subtracted, and we can restore it to the original configuration. We planned the 2 new theaters and new construction in what used to be a surface parking lot, and it was created by tearing down an original retail building several decades before. And the 300-seat theater is multi-form, and I think was very inventive. And so we have 2 people who can convert it from one configuration to the next, and there's 7 different configurations. They can convert it within 2 hours. The seating sections are on casters, and they can be shoved around and locked together. The side walls are somewhat movable, and then you can create portals to access for egress, for exiting and for entering the theater. And so you can play in the round as a matinee, and then in the evening you can play a thrust, or you can play 3/4 thrust and an avenue, and there are all these different configurations that can be created. And then we have this black box, the Helen, which is about 100 seats. So that was the Allen complex.
Fantastic. So why don't we take that as a transition to the Gartner at Cleveland Museum of Art. Obviously that's an iconic Marcel Breuer building. There was an element to updating it to be more acoustically appropriate for the type of performances that were happening there, but also amenable to the new audiences. What did you do there?
Another architect had looked at the auditorium and proposed that it be completely demolished and rebuilt, which was flawed for 2 reasons. One was it was unaffordable, and secondly, it ruined the work of a modern master, Marcel Breuer. The board kind of appealed for us to help. They knew we had a lot of experience in restoration, renovation, adaptive reuse in theaters, and we took it on, and you were involved in it, doing the lighting. The Breuer work of 1971 never functioned properly acoustically. In fact, they didn't open the auditorium with the opening of the museum. They tinkered around with it with acoustical renovations for about 1.5 years, and they kind of gave up on it. They never could use it the way it was intended, which was for a whole variety of performances that would require different reverberation times, from 1.2 seconds for a lecture or for cinema, to a little over 2 seconds for a chamber music concert. So we came in, we wanted to preserve the basic armature of Breuer, and so we kept the configuration, but we replaced the entire ceiling with perforated metal, but it looks opaque. So it's visually opaque, but acoustically transparent. I told the story of the Allen Theater being visually transparent and acoustically opaque. This reversed it. And so it looks solid, but it's not. And the sidewalls, and we stripped off a lot of the original material and we put it back in a way that was acoustically transparent but visually opaque, but with a rhythm that respected Breuer's rhythm and composition. It now has a reverberation range within about 2 seconds. It has all new technology. We expanded the stage. You added new lighting. I think it's a magical result from that. And now that has led us into further renovations, which we're working on now within the original Breuer lobby, which you're also working on now. And there are 8,500 square feet of motorized drapery that you don't see behind the rear wall and the side walls. And so you never know what mode this is in acoustically. Right. It always looks the same, but has a tremendous variety of acoustical responses.
Right. So that drapery absorbs the sound, but when you draw it back, it allows the sound to bounce off of the hard surfaces.
Be reflected off of these modulated sidewalls.
Yeah. So you spoke about the second office opening in Phoenix. I know the third office was in DC, and that's proved to be quite a successful office, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about how that came to being.
We always had architectural interns in our office. We would really try to cultivate them and grow their level of experience and so on. It was kind of an in and up model. But there was an architect, Jason Adolph, who had graduated from Kent State with a bachelor's degree, came into our studio. It was his first job. He worked for us for 9 years after graduation. And then one day walked into my office and had a letter of resignation. And I said to Jason, why don't you stay with us and we will form an office together in Washington, D.C. And we had no business to be there. We had no clients, we had no staff, and we didn't have an office. And Jason moved. We made a list of 100 targeted clients, Smithsonian, the GSA, the National Park Service, the Architect of the Capitol, George Mason University, the National Symphony. And we said, we'll go out and meet those people and see if we can cultivate them. And we built out an office. Again, we had no reason to. We had no staff. And we started pursuing work. We eventually got all but 1 or 2 of our top 20 targets. We worked for the Smithsonian. We'll come back to that with the Renwick. We got the commission to work on the U.S. State Department. We worked for the Architect of the Capitol. We worked for the National Symphony. We worked for George Mason University. We just knocked them all down. And we built this phenomenal studio out of Washington.
Transitioning to the Renwick project there, I remember at the interview there was some mishap with the disclosure of the rules of engagement during the interview that we weren't aware of.
Yeah, this is a great story. But you build your portfolio and you really build your practice out of a few really important iconic commissions. They're like the roots of your practice, and they're really marquee clients. Whether it's Playhouse Square, the Cleveland Orchestra, or Nederlander, but we really wanted to work for the Smithsonian, and they had a request for proposal solicitation to renovate the Renwick Gallery, which is the first public museum that was built in America. It was built in the Civil War. It was located right across from the White House. And so we renovated the Renwick, which received 20 significant design awards, an AIA Coty Top 10. Yep. You did the lighting. It was the first all LED museum.
Lighting, yeah, it was the benchmark for LED lighting in the U.S. at the time.
In the U.S. This incredible renovation, adaptive reuse, restoration, and it completely transformed our profile in the museum and the visual arts, fine arts world in the United States. That was an incredible commission, and we did that in an integrated design framework of our studios.
Yeah, I recall hearing that it was one of the first in recent memory for them that was both on time and on budget.
Yeah.
We haven't talked about the Wayne Aspinall project yet. and it'd be great to hear about that.
So in 2008, when the economy really tanked, the GSA came up with what were called the ARA projects, American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And they were going to stimulate the U.S. economy by providing jobs in design and construction of federal buildings. It was a massive federal building program and had to be procured really quickly. They wanted to spend the money and get it into the American economy. And we won this competition to design, when I was working on the Straz in Florida, I met a board member who actually worked for a construction firm that was based in Dallas and had an office in Tampa. And she suggested I meet the CEO of this firm, this construction firm. And I flew to Dallas. I met him. We agreed we should partner on a project together, the Beck Group. And when this solicitation came out for this federal building, I called Peter Beck and I said, is this the one? Let's team together. And we teamed in design build. And during the interview, and we showed all these renderings and the design approach, we said, for your budget, at no premium, we'll make this a LEED Platinum net zero energy building, which had never been done before. It was an historic landmark. So they gave us the commission. We did that. It was, an AIA Cody Top 10. It was the first landmark net zero building that was ever accomplished. Also, from a just pure architectural standpoint, won all kinds of awards for adaptive reuse and preservation. And that really made a mark in sustainable design and led us to be named by Architect Magazine the #1 sustainable design practice in the United States in 2012.
I believe it was after the DC office, you created an LA office, and that was on the heels of a meeting in New York with a former colleague.
Actually, I had started a Los Angeles office. We had had about 20 commissions in California, but never officially had an office there. I mean, the Balboa Theater, I'd worked on the Walter and Leonore Annenberg Estate in Rancho Mirage near Palm Springs, and worked on a number of other arts projects. We wanted to compete for the Bob Hope Veterans Hall in Los Angeles, which is a significant landmark and seismic upgrade. And so we started an office, formed a team, won that project, competing for that project, hired staff, and we had an office in California. It had a number of projects there. And that's where we started the Sacramento project. One of them was to do a building for the California Institute of Space Science, the KISS project, KISS, at Caltech. We made it into a net zero building. And I'm just illustrating this as a product of the collaboration with the Lair Studio and one of about a dozen projects we did under LAWRL.
Closer to Cleveland, but very significantly, there has been a number of projects at Oberlin. And maybe it started with cultural work, but expanded from there.
Oberlin was really a special client to me in that my grandmother had graduated from Oberlin in 1917, and I knew the campus well, and we certainly knew of the conservatory, and it was, such a celebrated American conservatory. We had kind of a reputation for doing projects in music, and we certainly had some reputation for adapting buildings and doing iconic design. But anyway, we were selected to do a new building for the conservatory, and it was really for jazz studies, but it was for all of Oberlin College, but it also included in the program the largest recording studio on any campus in the US. So we designed this building. What was given to us was this a study done by another Cleveland architect that did, in addition to these buildings by Minoru Yamasaki, but they glommed onto Yamasaki's work. And we decided that we should separate from Yamasaki's work, but just have a very low touch of a bridge and a tunnel under an historic circulation path that linked the oldest part of Oberlin with Tappan Square, that would just like skewer the conservatory between our addition and the Yamasaki work. So we developed this bar of a building. We wanted to pay homage to Charles Hall, who had invented the process to develop bauxite and aluminum, and had actually, which led to Alcoa, the founding of Alcoa, who had given Tappan Square where this circulation path went. And we went to Alcoa and we asked them to cast a custom aluminum ingot in a finish that we created after a lot of experimentation. And they did that in homage to Charles Hall. And then we had this interesting challenge of how to create this real environmental model of this iconic music building. And we created the first LEED Gold music building, and we did it by inventing a radiant system that we embedded in plaster in the ceilings. And the beauty of that was we used an absolute minimum of air just for ventilation, and therefore we had no, air is the enemy of acoustics because it creates breaches in ceilings and floors and walls. And by using a radiant system for cooling and heating, we were able to avoid, other than very minimal penetrations within surfaces. So it was a very innovative project. It was sustainable, it was iconic, it was published in Architecture magazine. I think it won 20 or 25 design awards. And it set us off on quite a program of design at Oberlin. We then renovated Yamasaki's Bibbins building, originally developed in the 1950s. And we developed a new recital hall that penetrated through the roof to get that volume. We also created a master plan for the Green Arts District, which has a LEED Platinum in. This has been executed now. We renovated the Apollo's Theater, funded by Danny DeVito and his wife, to house their cinema program. And then adjacent to the Hall Auditorium that had been designed by Harrison and Abramovitz in the 1950s, we designed this adaptable theater, which is much like the theater that we did here at the Allen. So we had a long run of really important commissions for the Oberlin Conservatory.
Similar to that, the recital hall at University of Nevada, Reno?
The University of Nevada, Reno was not a renovation. It was an addition to a really important landmark building by Richard Neutra. And it was on a really interesting site in that the site cascaded through 3 stories and down to like this fulcrum in the university, this really important site in the context of other university buildings. And it was to develop, the program was to develop a new recital hall, rehearsal room, a museum, and a fabrication studio. It was really important to us because this is really a major American university, the University of Nevada system, and a really important arts building. So that opened about 2 years ago to acclaim, or 3 years ago, and we've recently been commissioned to design the new visual arts for the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. So we have these incredible cultural academic commissions in Nevada, but to do new work in an academic context for these very prominent universities has been an important recent thing in our practice, and they are fantastic design opportunities, these recital halls. So it's really built our experience in music.
Speaking of new work on academic campuses, the Ohio State project is quite amazing. If you could speak about both the theater department as well as the Wexner addition.
Yeah, we became known, I think, to the Ohio State University when we worked in New Albany to develop, funded by a consortium of public-private entities, including generous funding from the Wexners. We developed a performing arts center on a K-12 school district in New Albany. So they were well aware of our performing arts background. We competed for it, but they hired us to do an arts district. And it's shouldered next to the Eisenman designed Wexner Center, for which we have designed a substantial renovation and expansion as the gateway to the campus. But we were commissioned to design a new School of Music and School of Theater adjacent to each other, and also their School of Moving Image Production, which is cinema. So we programmed and planned that. The School of Music is completed, and the School of Theater is about 6 months behind. But this is the most significant academics arts project that's been built in the U.S. in the last 5 years.
On the Wexner project, what were the design strategies to preserve that icon of Peter Eisenman's while making the addition?
We're not connecting to it above grade. Is the secret to it. So we're building an addition that connects low grade, and we're separating the building we're doing from what I call the scaffold that Eisenman did by a sculpture garden. You think of the Walker in Minneapolis. So, there's visual arts on the grade contiguous with the plaza, and it mediates between the building that we're doing, which is on High Street, and the Wexner Center, right. The original Eisenman work. The Arts District at Ohio State embodies a principle that you, Tom, and Chris Lozer, and others and I have proponed in many, many projects, which is expose the arts. The problem is because of the acoustic isolation required for theatrical facilities, and often also the isolation from natural light, and the acoustic isolation from music facilities. They traditionally were within bunkers, which is a shame because you take the vessels that have the greatest creativity and they're hidden. You hide the arts activity within. And what we've been doing and what we're doing at The Ohio State University is, to the greatest degree possible, exposing those venues. So we deal with variable enclosure, for the theaters. We deal with acoustic isolation, but then we have blackout shades and shades for visual privacy. But if you want to open up a recital to Annie and John Glenn Boulevard or to College Avenue, or you want to open up the large music rehearsal room, you can blow the whole thing open. And then the rear of the recital hall is entirely exposed in glass to Annie and John Glenn Boulevard, which is a major circulation route. And across the street from it, the Department of Theater, that vessel is also variable enclosure. And so these buildings are very permeable visually. They're acoustically isolated, but they're visually permeable.
One other great example of that I'd like to hear you talk about is Point Park University and how one of the theaters opens directly to the urban environment.
It's a little bit like Playhouse Square. It's the historic part of Pittsburgh, and it's at 4th and Forbes. And the buildings in that block are early 20th century buildings. And so the new theater complex is nested among landmarks. It adapts some of the landmarks for things like the costume shop and some of the program, and then it builds new construction that infills within the landmarks. But we were fairly constrained within the theater complex, within this urban context, between the front and the back of it, how much dimension we had to do load in, scene shop, crossover, stage, and then the audience chamber. And we couldn't arrange the lobby, and the lobbies are usually kind of the space that is the foyer, if you will, to the audience chamber, entered kind of sequentially and frontally. So we developed the lobby to the side, and we then took the side of the theater and completely opened it up with like a guillotine wall. So it's acoustically isolated. It can be blacked out, but it can be visually transparent. It can be completely open. And we put the theater on the street. So the rear wall of the theater is actually a really major urban street in Pittsburgh. And so we have all of these windows in this facade. They are triple glazed, so they're acoustically isolated. There are blackout curtains. But the idea was that during setup and rehearsals and even some performances, that people on the sidewalk or people in the cars can look through the rear of the theater and see the activity on stage. So, and then we took the 300-seat theater, which fronts on a courtyard which is open to the street, the same street that the theater backs onto. And we cut a huge opening in that wall. It's like 30 feet wide, 20 feet tall, acoustically rated door. And you can open that up like a proscenium, and that theater can play to the courtyard and essentially become a stage. So this thing of exposing arts activity is, this theme is something that we played around with on about 25 or 50 projects.
Yeah. No, it's great to see real examples of it being implemented.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the Bethel Woods amphitheater project, and obviously there's a great history of amphitheaters, large and small. There's another one that we did together in Lake Onondaga, outside of Syracuse, and that was a challenging project, design build with Gilbane, but it'd be great to hear a little bit about how that happened, and particularly relative to the integrated practice and how that project was able to implement.
Well, here, Tom, you're being very modest because you played an incredibly important part in the design of that project. But it did grow out of our amphitheater projects like Bethel Woods and Blossom and others. It was interesting in that there had been a very extensive study to develop this theater on this site. And the site was problematic. It was a brownfield site. It had solid waste. It had to be capped. It had environmentally degraded soils and subsoils. It's sitting here around Syracuse, New York on this lake. Tom and I go to this presentation pre-proposal of the city, the county executive, the head of the county commissioners, who declares that there's been this study and she's going to deliver by Labor Day, and I think we were there in September. Right. She was going to deliver within 1 year this $47 million project. It was going to be delivered design build, and presents it, and there are all these reporters there and so on. And then anyway, there's this solicitation for proposals. And we formed a team with Gilbane Construction. We were tasked with faithfully adhering to their program and a lot of their precepts, and then turning in a competitive proposal, as were the other teams. I think 3 teams did this. And each one of the teams, including ours, said that that approach and that proposal were somewhere between 80 and 87 million, not 47 million. And the county executive had already gone on record publicly that this was going to be delivered. And now it was like the clock was ticking, like 11 months later, 10 months later for 47 million. And so Tom and I said, I'll tell you what, we're going to preserve your operations and your functions and your capacity, and we're going to figure out how to do this for less than 50 million. And in about 2 weeks, we recomposed the whole thing. They said, okay, go ahead, do it. And so they put us under contract. Within 1 month, all the steel was ordered, right?
That's right.
All the steel was ordered. And they built this thing over a Syracuse winter, on frozen turf on a brownfield site. And we delivered it 2 weeks ahead of schedule with no change orders. But it was a beautiful composition. I think the things that we did well were position this amphitheater so that when the audience looks at the stage, they also overlook the Lake Onondaga. And we took all of the public, mingling areas and we stacked them on the backstage area so they could overlook the lake. And then and it was a brilliant move, took the cowl that wraps around, encompasses all the trusses at the rear of the pavilion, and you folded that like an origami with basically expanded metal. You don't see all of the infrastructure of trusses and sound equipment, and it is the most incredible cowl, and then it's beautifully lit. And it's like a pleated skirt. And it's mesmerizing how lovely this is and how quickly we threw the thing together.
You've started a number of businesses within the firm, which are not customary to architectural firms, relative to special engineering aspects or sustainability initiatives.
Mm-hmm.
And what were the drivers for you in those moves?
I think essentially originally the idea of recognizing the importance of all the disciplines that contribute to design comes from kind of comparing my father, who was an engineer, to my uncle, who was an architect, and kind of seeing them interact together and work together. One who's, quite visual and one who's quite mechanical. And realizing that to do a building, it's both. It's the synthesis both of the engineering and the technology, and it's the aesthetics of how you cloak all that and wrap all that and compose all of that. And I've always felt that all of those disciplines are equal in their contribution. So when you go to, the founding of different entities, it's in part to kind of recognize the diversity of design, of contribution to the design profession, and these different aspects that they're usually subordinated to architecture. Architecture is very hegemonic. The architects are kind of, look at me, talk about me, let's not talk about all the other stuff. It's never kind of given the accord. Unless you're doing the St. Louis Arch or something that is purely engineering, it's not celebrated. So some of the corporations were created. I created 35 corporations to practice because you needed registrations in different states and different disciplines. I started 8 offices. Some of those had to be licensed and registered in their jurisdictions. And then we started kind of following the interests of certain staff members and incorporating things and letting them kind of in a really entrepreneurial, creative side, take tranches of the design business and start to really develop those. It was really hard because we were deceived by so much of manufacturers' literature and specs. They would say, well, if we perform like this, and then you put their product in the field, whether it's a pump or something like that, and it's using more energy than was calculated. And so you're not quite at net zero energy, like you're very close. And so we started to say, okay, this should be validated, and we should have kind of an open system where you can log in, designers can log in the data that other designers can see, the actual empirical results. They can be tested and proven out. So we developed that under Recool. So we had a number of enterprises like that that really underpinned the values of sustainable design, but also it followed interests of different staff members who wanted to kind of pioneer research and development in those areas.
You mentioned the early influence of Louis Kahn on your career and your education. What was it like to work on one of his own field project?
I always admired Kahn's work, and which is why I went to Penn. You know, it then became kind of a pilgrimage to go to all the Kahn buildings that I could go to, whether it would be Salk or whether it would be the Kimball Art Museum or whether it would be Exeter Library, you know, and really experience them. I couldn't do that with this international work. I did go to, you know, Islamabad, and I did go to Dhaka and so on. But, you know, I really studied those projects. I mean, intensely studied those projects. I bought every book I could ever buy about Kahn and studied every building intensely. So it was an influence. But there was an RFP that came out about 6 or 7 years ago, and it was to renovate and restore and adapt the only theater that he ever designed and was built in Fort Wayne, Indiana. It's called, the complex is now called Arts United. And Kahn had done, the same year he started Salk, he was commissioned to do this master plan in Fort Wayne. He developed this enormous complex of like a new Philharmonic Hall and, you know, an arts conservatory and a museum. Anyway, the only part that was ever built was this theater. I thought, wow, to work on a building by Kahn would be incredible. And so there were 132 firms that submitted in response to the RFP. And they were from Japan and from Scandinavia. They were from all over. But I had a master's thesis at Harvard under the studio of Gerhard Coleman and McKinnell and Wood. As a thesis project, I had invented this problem to design a theater in the manner of Lou Kahn. And I had studied intensely, you know, the Fort Wayne project and had a portfolio of inked drawings, about 30 inked drawings of this thesis project and all the analysis of Fort Wayne. Wow. It was also a preservation project. So it was a thrill to be hired on that, but also, you know, the community, they didn't kind of recognize the assets they had. I mean, you know, Kahn's buildings are tough. There's a monumentality about them. You know, there's a palpability, and they're really archaic. You know, they're almost like ruins. And they're not necessarily friendly buildings, they're not necessarily beautiful buildings. They're very pure and elemental. The Fort Wayne project is a little bit liked by some, hated by most, despised by many. You know, it's just not a beloved landmark. Yeah. But part of my job then became educating the community about Lou Kahn and how this fit into the history of 20th century architecture and his oeuvre, and why they should care about it, why was it significant. And that was a wonderful experience for me because it took me back into all of the research in this building in particular, you know, all of his writings and so on, and the history of the building, and to refresh that and educate this community about Kahn, about a guy who comes here at age 7, face scarred from the fire in the Ukraine, and his family couldn't afford to buy pencils, so they burnt twigs, and he drew with charcoal sticks to earn money for his family. And he played the piano to accompany silent movies in order to make money to go to school. He slept on top of the piano because they didn't have a room for both a piano and a bed. I mean, a guy who was totally dedicated to art. Wow. Before architecture and to music. And it's, you know, I mean, I think he's inspiring.
Incredible. I'm sure he would appreciate the description of his buildings being archaic, among other things. What What happened to that plan, or what transpired?
Their
with that?
fundraising, I mean, we figured out how to get them tax credits.
Yeah.
They went off to raise the money, and I think they're about ready to move it forward. It's been out of the feasibility study for about 3 years. This is very typical of the arts projects in that they rely on private sector philanthropy, and which has been tough in the most recent environment, and they take a while to gel. I mean, they're not like developers housing or hospitality projects like a new Marriott hotel.
Yeah.
You know, these are things that, you know, some of my projects take 20 years, you know, from master plan to implementation. So, you know, you just have to be patient. And you have to partner with the community to show that vision of why it's important, why you should invest. And, you know, it's interesting because we're all aware of, you know, economics in the US in different industries. You can read about it in the paper every day. I've worked on about 300 cultural facilities. I can't name one that we've worked on that is bankrupt, closed, and out of business. Now, you cannot say that about any other sector of the private sector of the American economy. You know, I challenge you to go into housing or hospitality or retail, you know, but I'll tell you, the art at Playhouse Square is a great example.
Right.
You know, you're building these things for community quality of life. Once people realize their value, they're going to hang on to them. And you have to help them realize that responsibility and that vision.
Very directly related to that, following the Renwick project, you were awarded the Master Plan Commission for the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts.
Yes.
Which is also a long duration project and slow implementation of master plan elements.
The PAFA, Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, is the oldest combination art school and museum in the United States, founded in 1805. Has a collection of over 40,000 paintings by, you know, people like Eakins, you know, the Philadelphia School, among others. It has what is probably considered one of the greatest landmarks in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which is the Frank Furness designed, what's called the Landmark Building, which has the galleries and the sculpture studio. It's a phenomenal institution. So we finished the Renwick successfully. There had been a short list of 7 Philadelphia firms that had been drawn up as candidates to develop the master plan for PAFA. And the director saw an article, it was nationally published, about the opening of the Renwick. And he looked at the Renwick and the era of the Renwick, and he had PAFA in mind. He thought, we should talk to that architect. This is kind of a similar problem, meaning it's a 19th century context. We interviewed, and they hired us. We did the master plan, and we've implemented about 25 projects. And I would say it's fairly granular. There have been some larger projects. I mean, we did an auditorium. We've done the student galleries. We did a lot of faculty studios and faculty offices. We did visiting artist studios. And we've worked our way through the 1916 Hamilton building, which was originally like a car storage warehouse that PAFA now owns.
We've talked about how the firm evolved from a Northeast Ohio practice to a national practice, now a global practice. One thing we haven't really talked about is how the firm was founded by President James Garfield's son,
Abram.
And I guess it's over 10 years ago now.
He founded it in 1905.
1905.
So,
and over the course of its life, generally it was transitioned to new ownership internally. And in 2016, we merged with DLR Group. And it'd be interesting to hear what your thoughts are on the rationale for the merger and what the options were at the time for you. Obviously, you were the managing principal.
I wanted to make sure that there was a corporate structure that could serve the employees. You have to realize that in 2014, we were ranked the #1 firm in the United States overall as a design firm, and #1 in business. And it was kind of, like, who is going to manage this enterprise, which became very complex, in the future. So it's like, how do we guarantee everyone's sustainable future? And just to, jump ahead a little bit, the firm we merged with, DLR Group, is an ESOP. It's an employee-owned firm. It's not like it's closely held by, one person or 3 or 4 people. And so it guaranteed everyone that they had ownership of a very successful firm in the future. That was number one. I think the second thing was, it was a matter of aspiration and scale. I mean, we had continued to scale up first nationally, and then internationally, and then added these disciplines. And there was a hunger to continue to find the premier projects around the world, and also across the US. So even though we had grown our footprint, we were by no means really ubiquitous in our coverage of the United States. DLR Group has 32 offices, including in the Middle East and in Shanghai. It gave us an opportunity to look at work without any filter of geography. And DLR Group, they were looking for a synergy. They had no work in cultural arts in the portfolio, nothing. They didn't have healthcare, so they didn't do anything in adaptive reuse and preservation. So there were a lot of these areas where, Westlake Reed-Laskowski was specialized or concentrated. And that was both geographically and in building types. Also, in terms of disciplines, we had this whole integrated technology design group. We had lighting that DLR Group didn't have. We had technology, we had acoustics, we had audiovisual, we had a sustainable design platform. We had offices east of the Mississippi, in New York City, Charlotte, North Carolina. So the synergies were real. And so instead of saying, oh, well, we're now going to figure out how to divide what we both have, we saw a way of leveraging it that, if you're interested in working in Reno, Nevada, why not work in Seattle? And why not come into Omaha, Nebraska, where, so it opened up a whole world. And so, we are now in what is, the next generation, if you will, of Garfield, Westlake Reed-Laskowski's successor firms. It's ranked the #1 cultural design practice in the US and #2 in the world. And most of that based in Cleveland, Ohio. So it gave continuity, but it expanded our horizons. That was important. The third reason is kind of a practical reason, which is just the enterprise became so large that we didn't know how to transition it internally. I mean, you were one of the very few people in leadership who had the spine and the kind of confidence to be able to carry the firm on for another 15 or 20 years. I mean, you saw the vision and you were willing to take the risk, but you were rare. I mean, we talked to a lot of people about coming into ownership and investing in the firm, but I suppose you can blame yourself and me and other generation of owners. We built such a large enterprise, we didn't know how to transition it. But forming this partnership with this ESOP seemed to be the right thing to do.
Yeah, I can speak from my experience in that generally everyone has been very pleased with how the synergies have worked between the two firms.
It enormously expanded opportunities for design, but I think most importantly, it gave a lot of people in the firm in the next generation opportunities for leadership and to conduct very exciting practice.
Right. And across, like you said, a broader platform of offices.
Yes. Yes.
Shanghai is a good example of that in terms of how much easier it is to do work over there with the more established DLR office that became part of the group.
Yeah, you say that, you weren't in the call with me until 10:30 last night, which is, I mean, you know, you gotta, if you're going to, no, but I appreciate your comment. If you're gonna work in Asia from a US base, be prepared to give presentations at 3 and 4 in the morning into Vietnam. Be prepared to have a standing Monday night call ending at 10 or 11. You know, it's like you got to bridge across time zones. You got to be willing to fly 23 hours, you know, to get to the next office. And, you know, it does come with the sacrifice. So it's kind of like, how big's your ambition? Where do you want to work? And who wants to play at that level? And some people do and some people don't. You did.
I appreciate that, Paul. I think this is a good moment to kind of ask you, there's so much to celebrate, obviously, and there's so much we've learned, and I've learned a lot just in this conversation, but I'm sure a lot of people will be wondering, what do you think, what would you want your legacy to be?
Well, I always wanted to be, you know, known as a champion of design excellence. And I think I've done that even in the 6 years since we merged with this other firm. And I think it's to cultivate the portfolio and the design brand. I think it's been to, you know, to create this recognized expertise within certain tranches of design, like facilities for music, cultural facilities, those types of things, you know, to be able to brand a practice, you know, which is an absolute pleasure to work in, you know, where every project is a design opportunity and where every project is kind of a gift to the community, right, of entertainment and culture. I think that would be a goal as well. I hope that it's cultivated a respect for all the different forces that have to come together to create buildings. It's more than architecture. It's kind of scientific, artistic collaboration, respect, if you will, for the disciplines, and recognizing that you can make an architecture of light. If you see the work through the minds and the vision of the different disciplines, there's an incredible richness of innovation. I hope I've instilled in people the confidence that that's the right practice model. I know when we first started engineering, everybody, for 10 years, said, are you ever going to pull the plug on engineering? They had no confidence that it was going to be sustainable, that we'd have a failure, or it wouldn't be profitable, or there'd be a reason where we pull the plug on it. And I would say, you know, I think a firm is a belief system. Like, you have to have this kind of unwavering confidence that it's the right model. And once you dispel that or destroy that, you lose the whole culture of confidence of the employees. And so, you know, if you start the Phoenix office, if you start engineering, if you go into Shanghai, if you start lighting, you have to make those work. And you have to show that they add value, and they will, but you have to prove them out. When you ask what's the legacy, I think it's been to have confidence that we can innovate in the practice model, be all-encompassing of disciplines, and make it work, and not abandon it. We'll make it work, and we'll be distinguished by that.
That's fantastic. I, for one, would say you've accomplished.
I hope so, but I think there's so much more to do.
Well, if just on that, if there's one thing that you would do differently were you to do it over, have you ever thought of that?
Well, I certainly wouldn't have any regrets about being an architect. I might have some regrets about, like, the reckless abandonment of health and welfare by flying all over the place and red-eyeing. And, you know, you have to observe to be able to design. I mean, the more you see, the more you ingest in your experience in design, the better off you are as a designer. You really have to see as much as you can of art and architecture and everything that influences that. And you don't know, how that's all going to play into the warp and the weft, of the tapestry of design. But what you have to do is assimilate everything you possibly can. The exhilaration is finding out that you can come back and draw on something that you discovered decades before that give you that spark of inspiration. And so then I just encourage people to have that quest to see